Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. My name is Sheila Siemens. I'm the director of the Noyo Center for Marine Science, and we're super excited to have you here tonight. We're excited to have our design team with us today to help present the conceptual designs. The Noyo Center has a foundational ethic about being what this community wants and what this community needs. And I think after 10 years, if you're not aware, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary, 10-year anniversary this year. After 10 years, I think we're feeling like we have a better understanding of what this building needs to be to support this community and coastal resilience in the coming years. And that's what we're working with this amazing design team to help articulate. But we really do want your input, and we want to know, even in this early design phase, what you think works and what you think doesn't work. So please don't hesitate to send us information at info@noyocenter.org, or if you know any of us, to reach out to us specifically. And I'm going to give the first part of this conversation, and then I'm going to hand it over to our amazing design team from EHDD and SCAPE, and they will present different components of our design. But I'd like to start out. So Steve is actually going to start my presentation for me and give you some of the background about this project and how we got to where we are today and where we're going after this. So I'm going to give you a little context before we jump straight into the design work. The Ocean Science Center out on the 12 acres that we have on the Fort Bragg Headlands this project was funded by the Economic Development Agency. So we got a grant to do a number of things to help us create the collateral we thought, to effectively go out and do a capital campaign and fundraise to build and operate this type of building. So all of those components are listed here. What's listed in black are things that we've done, and what's listed in blue are things that are yet to be done. So one of the things that was really clear to us is that we needed to understand, as we've been working with a number of partners within this community, to develop a strategy for developing a blue economy in Fort Bragg. What does that really look like here? So the first part of this work really focused on developing that blue economy feasibility study to say what of all of the universe of things fits well within our community. So that piece was done. And what we were really interested in that is, how does that affect the design, potential design of what we want to build out on the headlands? Then we initiated the architectural design with EHDD and their team. EHDD is a premier architectural organization based in San Francisco and has worked on many of the aquaria and marine science centers around the country, but also in California specifically. Came with amazing credentials and put together an amazing team, which you'll hear about from Steve. And we're really looking forward to continuing to work with them. So part of their team's job is the site master plan. So we're looking at that entire 12 acres and trying to figure out where everything fits and how do we look at this site strategically. Part of that includes a wetland restoration plan, because we have a drainage ditch. So the property that we have out on the headlands was originally log drying decks. And they had a drainage channel through that property that is now a jurisdictional wetland. So how do we take a straight created ditch and turn it into a vibrant wetland? I can't wait to let Hogan tell you the answer to that question. Then we went into the conceptual design phase. So so now we have sort of an idea of what things we want, what places, how do we look at those buildings and figure out how much is enough for this community and not overstretching because of the costs. After we get done with that, we will then move into the schematic design phase. That's coming next. At the end of the schematic design phase, we'll create cost estimates, and we'll look at how to adjust our parcel to fit what we need to do. And that's something I'm not really going to talk about too much tonight, but we have some issues around our parcel boundaries right now. Another piece of this work is the operational business plan. So one of the things my board is extremely concerned about is making sure that we don't over-design something we can't then support. So once we have an idea of what this building is, what it looks like, what it's going to do, then we can start figuring out what the cost of running that building is and what the potential revenue is. And part of the work that Steve and his team did for this component is a market feasibility analysis, which he'll talk about briefly. We've heard a lot of kind of estimates about tourism and potential revenue from program fees, but this was a deep dive into those issues and was a really great component of this work. We also did an organizational growth projection, an organizational growth strategy. What does the Noyo Center need to look like in order to operate this type of building and do the kind of work that we want to do? So it's sort of a 10-year strategic plan. We still have yet to do the building systems and utility costs. That will come after the schematic design phase. And then finally, the last piece of this work is the NEPA and CEQA environmental reviews. Once we know exactly what we want to do, then we start going through all the permitting. And then at that phase, we think we'll have a project that's fairly ready to talk to people about. We feel very comfortable with. Okay, next slide. So this is sort of all of that in a graph, in a timeline. So we did that blue economy feasibility work first. As you can see in blue, completed that in early summer. And then we started the conceptual design phase with the architects that completed, in mid-fall. We did the market feasibility analysis that completed late fall. And now we're in this pause where we're trying to gather input from the community and from various stakeholders. And then after this, we'll go into the next phase of more advanced design. Next slide. Okay, and the approach. So the approach to this work, it's really important to understand that we are looking at this from 3 different standpoints. Environmental resiliency. So how can we turn a former industrial mill site property into a vibrant habitat? So, and how do we integrate our facilities into that landscape, and how do we integrate our community into the headlands? So we want environmental resiliency. We also want cultural resiliency. How do we build something that really supports the needs of our community? And that's where a lot of the work we're doing with the tribes and some of the work we're doing within Fort Bragg to look at what we need from educational standpoints. That's where all that is coming in. And that's where this 10 years worth of development is really supporting a lot of that. And then what is economic resiliency? So I'll remind you that one of the reasons that the city of Fort Bragg launched the Noyo Center initially was an economic resilience initiative. And we've taken that very seriously, and that's why we've done so much work on this blue economy feasibility. How do we right-size the building, but then also how do we become a key asset to developing more opportunities within a blue economy in the North Coast? All right, Steve. So goals. We have this 3-pronged approach to our work. We want to engage the community, we want to provide educational opportunities, and we want to develop research on the coast. And those goals are reflected in this slide. We want to reconnect the city of Fort Bragg to the coast. That was fundamental from the beginning. We want to establish a community hub dedicated to ocean health, fostering scientific inquiry and educational initiatives. So all of these things are things you've probably heard me talk about in the past, but these are the things that were driving the work and the design that Steve and his team did. Highlight the unique features of the Mendocino coast. There's no research institute between Bodega and Humboldt. We want to fill that gap. How to become a destination that fosters a deep sense of local pride, draws residents, but also brings tourism to our community. Serve as a crucial community asset and a critical part of that blue economy. We have already discussed that. And then how do we continue to address an uncertain future? How do we continue to look at climate change and climate resilience for this community? And lastly, and probably as important as any, is also one of the reasons why the city of Fort Bragg and so many of you supported the initiative of the Noyo Center was so we can showcase what design and restoration looks like on a former industrial mill site. So how do we create a net zero building and a recovered landscape that can be a showcase for a lot of those techniques. Next slide, please. So one of the first things, and this is part of why we're looking at the parcel boundary adjustment, one of the reasons, one of the things that has become really very clear over the last couple of winters is this issue of coastal erosion. And one of the things that we realized we wanted to do was be as thoughtful as we can about what does coastal erosion look like in our community. as we go forward with climate change and increased swells and larger storms. So this first line, this orange line, is sort of the base setback that was created in 2009 by a group called the Pacific Institute. And that was sort of the reasonable starting place. But Steve and his team looked at 3 other scenarios and presented this to our board that were varying degrees of risk analysis. And what we ultimately came to decide is that we wanted to use approach 3, which is this yellow line. And that is basically putting, and to give this perspective, I think the Coastal Commission requires 100 or 150 foot setback for coastal development. This would put us back about 460 feet off the coast for a good and solid design that we feel comfortable with a 100-year horizon. And how we've come to look at this is that we still want to restore a lot of that habitat in the front to kind of mitigate some of that coastal erosion. But the buildings themselves would be behind that yellow line. Okay, next slide, please. So Steve is going to talk about this a little bit more, but this is the concept for how the campus is laid out. And again, for anyone who was part of any of the discussions about the runway is not included in this. We do not want to build and we do not want to encroach upon the runway. So forgive me for having a slide that shows that. But you can see here that we have a public exhibit hall to the left of the, that's what we're calling the interpretive center. We have a beautifully restored landscape. And then, like, I can't use my pointer, but we have a research and thank you, Steve. research campus in this general area. And then over to the far right is where we have the laboratory, which we hope to break ground on next year, which is where it will be our workshop to put together the blue whale skeleton and do other kind of programs in that space. So I'll let Steve talk more about that in a minute, but that's basically the site concept. Okay, next slide. One of the things that this project also funded was some advanced exhibit design. So you can imagine we have a 73-foot blue whale skeleton to put in this building. We really want to know what it looks like, what it's going to look like. One of the things that we really pushed the boundaries on is how to articulate these skeletons to really bring to life their movements and their activities when they're alive. And so one of the things we've toyed with is a lunge feeding pose for a blue whale, which actually, if you don't realize, a blue whale will go along and then curve to the left and almost will go over 9 degrees, like 95 to 100 degrees upside down to feed and open their mouth to feed. It's like the biggest biodynamic event on the planet. Huge, but will that translate from a skeletal standpoint? So you can see how this, so we actually we got some money to digitally articulate in 3 dimensions that skeleton of ours. We had already had all of the bones 3D scanned, so we digitally articulated those bones, and we now can put that animal in these 4 different poses within the building that Steve and his team was designing to see if we not only are creating an exhibit that's impactful, but one that kind of makes sense and one that maximizes that viewer experience from all different angles. So this one is showing the whale off on its side, and we can look at this now in 3 dimensions and see if that's an interesting pose. So for something that's as significant as that big skeleton, this is an amazing opportunity for us to really make sure we're doing that right. Okay, next slide. Another component of the work we're doing is seawater intake. So really one of the biggest constraints to developing blue economy initiatives here and for us doing research at the Ocean Science Center is seawater. So seawater is the question. How do we do it? We're working with all of our partners at the Noyo Ocean Collective to create a solution that would support this community as well as the Noyo Center and the Ocean Science Center. And we're currently looking at 3 options. So one of the next phases of this work will be to really dig into these 3 options and prioritize them. One would be an estuarine system within the harbor that could also support live fisheries down in the harbor. Another would be a beach well, a Noyo Beach. And a third would be an open water system closer to our property. So this is something that's still very much in development. Next slide, please. Is that it?
I think that's it, Sheila.
Okay, so I said I wasn't really going to talk that much about the property boundary issue, but that had to do with both that coastal setback and some of the and our wetland restoration. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve Dangermond. He's the principal from EHDD, and let him take it away from here.
Thank you, Sheila. So I'm Steve Dangermond. I'm a principal with EHDD Architecture in San Francisco. I'm joined by a couple of colleagues tonight. Jessica Sano and Ryan Metcalf are both from my office and have been working on the project. And Hogan Edelberg will be presenting with me tonight, and he's our landscape architect from SCAPE Landscape Architecture, also out of San Francisco, and they are one of the preeminent landscape architects in the country, especially when it comes to restoration and resiliency and issues such as that. We have a much larger engineering team, including Sherwood Engineering, who's been our civil engineer and environmental engineer, and we have structural, mechanical, and other engineers that are helping with the design. So we're going to run through this. The presentation is primarily about the site and the approach to the site and the kind of site master plan, and then the Ocean Science Center, which is the kind of public visitor center component of the project. But we have a couple thoughts I'll show you about the other pieces as well. But that's been the large part of our focus up to this point. And from a public visitor standpoint, you know, we took as an early kind of theme for the project is the idea that visitors here would be learning about science just by walking around the campus, the site, and the visitor center. But we want to create a rich and exciting visitor experience in both the kind of restored bluff area, but also in the visitor center itself. So we're at the end of concept design. This is where I'll put in some caveats where the images that we'll show you are, you know, we're trying to establish the kind of overall look and feel and size and kind of scope of the project and the major exhibits and things like that. There'll be a lot of work to do, and I'll drop some other caveats as we show images of the building, which is not completely designed yet. The downside of modern computer design technology is that things look very finished, even when they're not. So, I'm going to turn it right over to Hogan here right at the beginning to talk about the site approach and restoration ideas.
Great. Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for being here tonight. As Steve mentioned, my name is Hogan Edelberg. I'm with SCAPE Landscape Architecture, and it's been a pleasure to work with this team to date on this project. We're really excited to see it move forward. I'll just touch on this slide briefly. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the site and knows how amazing it is. Four of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit tonight are highlighted in the photos here. So of course, the site is really kind of dominated by the view to the Pacific Ocean. And we thought a lot about how to maintain those view sheds and also access to the water throughout the campus. The existing conditions and presence of the former Georgian mill site to the east is something that we kept in mind when talking about the layout of the buildings, the placement of the wetland restoration, and the site circulation, considering kind of the future of that site and what may or may not occur. The coastal grasslands of the Fort Bragg Headlands, and this is something that I'll talk a little bit more about, as Steve mentioned, is kind of the ecological approach to this site. But building on what's there today, what used to be there and what we think can be there tomorrow. And then really tying in that site access, not only to the former airstrip, but also to the coastal trail that runs to the north and south of the site. Next slide. So you saw this before on Sheila's slide. I think what I'd like to do is ask everyone to look just to the bottom left first. at the what we call the partie diagram, or just a really simple graphic that explains our approach to the site. And just backing up very quickly, when we started this project, we were exploring different ways with Steve and Jessica and Ryan to lay out buildings on this site, and really to even consider the architecture and the landscape as a whole on the site. And what we came to was this idea of a campus, and really the campus as a way to draw people into the site and to make it a public grounds, not only for folks who may be working at the Ocean Science Center or doing research there, but for anyone who's passing through on the coastal trail or sees something interesting and wants to walk in. That idea of learning about science just as you walk around can begin right as you enter the site. So that strong blue line you see on the diagram on the left that we have labeled the coastal trail on the map, that's really our spine that ties the coastal trail to the south, access from the runway, to the coastal trail from the north, and allows everyone to walk freely through the site. The campus buildings shown in white in the diagram, and then you can see them on the plan on the right, the Ocean Science Center itself, what we're calling the research cluster and potentially future buildings, as well as the laboratory, are all connected through this web of circulation. One more thing you can see in this one before we go on to the next slide is the coastal prairie wet meadow. So I'll talk a little bit more about the approach to this, but it's a central organizing feature to the site. We really wanted to turn the need for wetland restoration and the desire to connect to the community, combine those two and turn them into a central design principle for this project. Next slide. So we zoomed into this a little bit already. I think today we will be focusing mostly on the wetland and a little bit of our circulation approach. So I'll talk about those in a bit more detail in the plan. The areas in the lighter green, the kind of the organic shape, I think I can actually kind of give you a rough outline here on the screen. This is what we're calling the coastal prairie wet meadow, which is our approach to wetland restoration. And that has a couple of different components that I'll explain in more detail, but it really starts to create and has a relationship with the other planting areas on the site, the other areas of site restoration. And is not only a standalone wetland restoration that's happening sort of on the side of the building. You can see just stop annotating there. Labeled in number 13 is the coastal prairie wet meadow. We have a couple opportunities to cross that, giving chances to learn about it, to engage in the science and the monitoring, and to stop it as an overlook by number 12, number 10, and number 9. Thank you, Steve. And the circulation, what you can see here in the darker orange and the lighter tan, is really this network that allows kind of a lot of freedom of movement on the site, a really clear entryway from the south, and also another concept of education that we're excited to talk about a little bit more today. So if that is a little bit high level, we're going to dive into it in the next few slides. And actually, I think this is back to you, Steve. I'm sorry, my drawing is still on the screen.
There, I got it. So this is just a moment to say that part of the master planning of the site has been thinking of them in these kind of individual projects, not calling them phases because they're components that could happen all together or in sort of any sequence depending on how the funding comes about and so forth. But we wanted to make sure that we didn't put anything in a place that would prevent other things from happening. So a guiding principle of the master plan was really thinking about the project in pieces and allowing it to kind of grow organically in any order that we think makes sense.
So I touched briefly on the site circulation and the campus spine. The image on the left is a precedent image from Sonoma Coast State Park, and that really is an image that we latched onto as a beautiful example of the character of the pathways that we envisioned for this site. The natural beauty of this area is just so amazing, as Sheila mentioned, and we I've been working really closely with EHDD and the Noyo Center to embed the landscape design, the site approach into this area. And that means not using a lot of introduced materials. It means not adding extra concrete or extra asphalt where we can avoid it. And it also means making sure that people can explore the site and learn about it as they do so. The coastal trail connection is highlighted in blue in this diagram. I see a question that has popped up about parking, and you can see parking noted just on the south of the screen there, the letter P. So there'll be a direct connection from parking to the Ocean Science Center, which is a very short walk. It may look a little bit out of scale on this diagram, but it's a very short walk.
These diagrams show parking on the existing runway, and it's not clear if that's actually going to be a feasible approach or not. We may end up creating a separate parking lot for parking in the future, but it would probably be at this southernmost part of the site.
Thank you, Steve. From the campus spine, you'll have the chance to access the Ocean Science Center, the research cluster in the buildings, the laboratory, and also some of the other amenities that we have on the site that were labeled in the previous plan, but an outdoor amphitheater, outdoor classrooms, and areas to stop and rest and capture the ocean view. In pink, what's labeled concentric loop is a concept to really also create an interpretive trail, a small loop that goes in and out of the Ocean Science Center itself. So really drawing some of that educational program from the landscape into the building and vice versa. It's something that we found in our research on the site as a Native American concept of living with the land. It's really kind of about seasonality as we understand it and understanding the ebbs and flows of nature. So I can't speak to it in great detail without, I'm sure, putting my foot in my mouth, but we think it's a really great opportunity for future exploration and an opportunity for partnership as we move this project forward. It really brings some of that educational component and knowledge about the site out into the landscape. And this collage shows what it could look like as you enter the Ocean Science Center from the parking to the south. And what you can start to see here, of course, are the expansive views it'll still have throughout the landscape, but also some of the different planting zones and planting areas that we've introduced into the concept to help give the site a little bit more structure and also really bring back some of that ecology that was present on the site once before. So in addition to the other goals of ecological restoration, wetland restoration, we've been working very closely to make sure that there's a direct connection from parking to the Ocean Science Center. It's a very clear and thoughtful entry experience that really kind of lives up to the mission of the Noyo Science Center itself. On the site, there's a lot of grassland right now. And when we started doing research onto the site, into the logging history, into the ecological history, and digging into how to address some of the contamination that's on the site and how to integrate this wetland restoration, we really latched onto this idea of coastal prairie wet meadow and kind of coastal terrace prairie as two cornerstone ecosystems that we could use to explore the possibilities on the site. In just a minute, I'll talk a little bit about how we propose to use the wetland restoration to create the coastal prairie wet meadow. But before that, I just want to point out one thing you probably noticed in the middle, which is the coastal forest. We were excited to learn that there used to be redwoods on this very site. Before they were logged, they actually extended all the way out to the ocean where the Ocean Science Center is proposed. And as a way to really respect and sort of bring back the site history and also increase biodiversity, we're proposing a couple areas of strategic coastal forest restoration using an innovative microforest technique, which will allow the trees to propagate in the windy and salty environment. By creating this gradient of different ecosystems, all the way from coastal terrace prairie through the bluff scrub, the coastal forest, the wet meadow, and the riparian pond, we can start to create ecotones that shift between ecological zones, which really increases the biodiversity of the site, and therefore makes it a lot more interesting and educational as well. So how do we go about restoring the wetland? Sheila mentioned that there's a existing ditch. It's a man-made ditch on the site, a drainage channel that has kind of turned into a wetland over time, and now is a recognized wetland asset. Typical wetland restoration, what you can see on the section on the top, involve excavating out from that lowest elevation of the ditch and creating a larger flat area at a lower elevation than the surrounding terrain, which then becomes your wetland. That can be pretty invasive. It can use a lot of heavy machinery. And in a lot of cases, if there's existing vegetation on the site that you think you can use again, or also if you're just thinking about the carbon emissions from all the work, it is not very sustainable. So what we are exploring on this project is something that's been done more and more. It's being done more and more throughout California, which is called an elevated wetland, where you actually strategically allow that the land to flood, and you control that by doing very small grading moves, really like a foot difference in grading in elevation between one area and the other. And that allows something which is much closer to what used to happen on this site to occur, this coastal prairie wet meadow, where you have essentially kind of a wet grassy area, which becomes your wetland. There's areas of deeper water, and then there's areas of much shallower water. Next slide, please. You can see a couple of examples of what this looks like being done in the different areas of California. And the way this works is really by trying to represent or recreate, I should say, a beaver dam, or the work of what the animals would do on the site if we weren't there. A beaver dam is just one way to do it, but the point is that you're backing up water strategically in one area, creating a riparian pool. And then the water seeps slowly through that into a depressed meadow area. So it's not open water, it's not just grass, it's that combination of both that defines the coastal prairie wet meadow. And this has been done throughout California. As I mentioned, there's an example in Point Reyes, which is really beautifully done. It can be done with a lot of handwork, doesn't need a lot of machinery. And given the context of the site and the goals of the Noyo Center, it's really appropriate for the Ocean Science Center site. And the coastal redwood forest restoration, we really wanted to dig into this because, of course, redwood propagation in this coastal marine environment is challenging. But there's a technique that is called the Miyawaki method of forest restoration. It was developed in the 80s in Japan and has actually started to take off much more recently in the US. Some examples in California and some on the East Coast. And essentially what you do is you tightly pack plants, much more so than you would in a traditional forest restoration. And you include all layers of that forest, from the canopy to the mid-canopy to the understory. The fast-growing understory protects the trees as their saplings. And then over about 2 years of growth, it becomes a self-sustaining forest with about a 90%, 85 to 90% survival rate, which is very high. And it transitions into a mature forest with about a 45 to 50% survival rate after about 20 years. So we think these could be really amazing outdoor kind of learning labs to track the forest growth over time, speak to the site history, and start to create those ecotones throughout the site, opportunities for education, and landmarks to draw the community into the site.
Hogan, there's a question about managing runoff from newly introduced impervious surfaces.
That's a great question. The stormwater management strategy on the site essentially is to use as much low impact development best practices as possible. So the coastal terrace wet meadow would also serve as a stormwater management feature. For the landscape approach, we're really minimizing any new impervious surfaces. We do stabilized natural materials if possible. Decking around the building also reduces the amount of impervious surfaces, and we can capture the runoff from the building roof as well. But that's a great question. So the goal is as little additional infrastructure as possible. This is my favorite collage. So this is if you're standing on the bridge, right as it crosses the coastal prairie wet meadow, looking back at the Ocean Science Center, and you can see a representation of the coastal forest. Of course, it's showing maybe in 20 years. But you really kind of get a sense of the different ecosystems, those ecotones, and the educational opportunities, both outside the site and how the building draws you in the background.
So when it comes to the Ocean Science Center itself, I think that we're trying to strike a balance in the design between something that both feels very appropriate to the bluff site and like it really belongs there, natural materials, perhaps a green roof, but also has a kind of a drama to it and a scale that is visible from the road and a presence out on the bluff to make it feel really special and like you're really coming to something interesting. So this is again a different version of the collage showing the approach from the south, from the parking area, and the building has a horseshoe shape with its back turned to the prevailing winds. We know it's a very windy site, and the idea is that we'll create a protected courtyard that helps bring the landscape in and kind of connect the building to the landscape, but create a sheltered place where all kinds of outdoor activities could happen. And it becomes a kind of way you enter the building is into this court space before entering the building itself. So here's an image of what that courtyard might be like. There might be fountains that imitate different whale spouts. We think that there's an active area for kids and perhaps a crash tank and a certain amount of planting, but then also hardscape that's usable for different public events and festivals and dinners and private events and all kinds of things when the weather permits. We've thought a lot about the Noyo Center had a lot of ideas about different exhibit components, and we started off with the typical idea of trying to find a way to kind of connect all these different exhibit stories into a cohesive kind of storyline. And we realized that for this facility, that maybe is not the best approach. Instead, we want to tell a lot of kind of smaller individual stories. They are connected, but if over time one story gets kind of replaced with another, it doesn't disrupt the whole flow of the facility. So, and that's because the Noyo Center is going to be doing active actual science that will evolve over time. We want to create a facility where that science can always be interpreted and kind of old stories can be removed and replaced by new stories. So this shows this diagrammatic plan shows the kind of horseshoe shape. The purple areas are the exhibit experiences, which I'll kind of walk you through in a second, and then the tan spaces on the right-hand side are more programmatic spaces, classroom, makerspace, and so forth. But the idea is that you would enter the courtyard here, and then to the left you would enter into a lobby space that has the usual kind of retail and restroom support and a welcome desk, but also would have what we're calling a situation room, which is a temporary gallery that could talk about current events and current science that's going on. These are some images that show kind of what it might be like as you walk through. Again, my caveat about this being a very conceptual design at this point, you're not seeing a lot of columns and beams, for example, and a lot of glass. We know that there's more glass here than will be in the final design, but it gives you a sense of the scale and layout of the building. So this is that entry space with welcome desk and the situation room. And then the next thing that you would proceed to would be a series of kind of immersive wet exhibits, a touch tank, the crash tank that I mentioned before, and then this immersive kelp exhibit. We're trying to think of all of these exhibits not like like we would for a great big public aquarium, but instead as a smaller facility where the different experiences are scaled to kind of a family group or you and your friends. It's not kind of a lot of big wide open spaces with big tanks. Instead, it's trying to create, for example, in this exhibit, what it really feels like to be immersed in a kelp forest with actual fish and water and kelp to either side of you, and maybe a projected view on the ceiling that would show what it's like to kind of look up through the kelp at the daylight above. From there, you would proceed into what we're calling the main gallery, which would have not just the blue whale skeleton shown here in its feeding pose, but other additional skeletons as well. The Noyo Center has a growing collection of skeletons that we want to create space to exhibit. And then also these small immersive dome theaters, which again are not scaled to like a big theater that you would go into and sit with 90 other people, but instead it's a very small immersive theater experience, as is done. This is an example from the Cal Academy that's been done recently, where it's scaled to half a dozen people, and you can choose the programs that you want to see. And it's very much a kind of evolved version of what the Noyo Center has done down on Main Street in their current facility. Beyond the blue whale skeleton, you know, we're thinking that this is a kind of a large floor area which would double for multiple uses, but there would be a cafe beyond, and upstairs above the cafe would be this observation deck and library, which is located in a position where you'd get fantastic views out over the bluff into the ocean, but also would be kind of a hands-on library experience, not unlike what we completed recently at the Presidio Tunnel Tops here in San Francisco, with a field station kind of feel and materials that you and your family could take a look at and take a break and examine. So that's most of the kind of public exhibit path. And the remainder of the building, we're planning on a large commercial kitchen. And I will say parenthetically that the kelp tank and the commercial kitchen were both suggestions of our economist consultant that I'll talk more about in a moment, but she really recommended, after kind of looking at our proposal, looking at the demographics of the area and the visitorship, and really thinking about how this can be a self-sustaining facility, she really recommended emphasizing events of all kinds in the facility. And so we've tried to build in not just the kitchen support, but as you'll see, a lot of the public spaces in the courtyard are scaled to allow for lots of different events to occur, after hours, and kind of seasonal events. And we've arranged a makerspace, classroom, community room cluster in a way that those can be joined or be separate for events of lots of different types. And this is a view then of the main gallery set up for a banquet or some kind of event. You could have things out in the courtyard. We're thinking there would be doors that connect the two, and it could make a really terrific and unique space to have events of all types. This is a view then outside of the cafe. We're thinking that it's a really publicly accessible space from the coastal trail. You could take a break and step in and enjoy coffee or a bite to eat. But it's also a bit of a tease for what goes on in the rest of the facility. Another view of the courtyard, kind of looking back out the open end of the horseshoe, and showing some of the elements that I talked about, but we're thinking there could be play structures for kids that would be themed, such as this. That's a 2-scale blue whale heart that's been turned into a play structure for kids, and so you would get a sense of the kind of enormous scale of a blue whale heart, but also provide a place for kids to have activities. And the classroom and makerspace, we're thinking these are very hands-on, activity-rich spaces, not like traditional classrooms, but instead places where like things can really happen. Here is a view then of the facility from across the wetlands, from the research hub, showing how it kind of rises up from the bluff towards the views out to the ocean. And just to show we are thinking about what the research space might be like, we're thinking it starts with a smaller facility with wet lab and dry lab and researchers' offices, and would probably have this kind of flexible workshop type character, such as this is a lab building that we did. It's actually a global ecology lab at Stanford University. We've got that, Jessica, we've got that mislabeled. And so there could be wet space with seawater tanks for aquaculture prototyping or different experiments. And again, it would be something that would be flexible and would be positioned in a way that we could add modules and grow the research over time. We're also thinking there's a lot of demand for a housing component, and what we show here is what we think would be a very analogous housing development at the Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences in Maine. They're kind of set up as they can be used as dorm rooms. You could have classrooms of kids come and stay for a weekend experience, or you could have rooms dedicated to individual researchers for a semester, or grad students, trying to build in a lot of flexibility, but with a kind of modular housing approach with a shared living and kitchen area. Just another view then of the campus from the coastal trail. And I want to talk a little bit about we really want to make this an example project for sustainability and make it a net zero energy and possibly net zero water consumption facility. And Sheila mentioned the ideas of environmental resiliency, cultural resiliency, and economic resiliency. We really want to make this as low energy and as low carbon, both in embodied carbon and operational carbon, as we can manage. And so we've been looking at, this graph shows from left to right how much metric tons of CO2 equivalent carbon would be in a baseline, a kind of business as usual structure, with the red being the embodied carbon that's embodied in the construction of the building, but then the blue would be the operational carbon. In other words, the carbon given off from the energy use of the facility over a 30-year time frame. We know that by going to an all-electric building, as the energy grid gets cleaner and cleaner, we reduce the amount of carbon by not having the building have its own combustion and emissions. But then as we pay a lot of attention to what we make the building out of, we can then start to reduce the embodied carbon in the building. And by sequestering carbon in the landscape and in our choices of materials, going to probably a mass timber building, heavy timber, and having offsetting photovoltaics that generate power on site, we can then achieve a net zero carbon building, which would be our goal. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the market study that was done by our economist, Elena, who's with Elevative LLC. She's a someone we've worked with on a number of projects. She's a nationally recognized economist for these types of projects. So we kind of leaned on her to give us a discount and get involved in this project and do a market potential study for us to look at, not just to kind of get an accurate take on how many people might come to this facility, but then also benchmark it against other similar facilities and make sure that we're not building something that the Noyo Center wouldn't be able to maintain and operate for the revenue that's generated from visitation and events. So her study looked at the kind of 2-hour catchment area resident market, but then she also was able to tap into data that confirmed that Mendocino County gets about 1 million visitors a year with an impressive average stay of over 2 nights per visitor. So people are coming and staying for multiple nights, and confirming also that there are few competing attractions. That, you know, there just wouldn't really be anything like this in the Mendocino coast and this whole area. And as I mentioned, her analysis suggested that the Ocean Science Center should maximize the potential for events in order to maximize earned revenue. And her conservative visitation potential showed somewhere between 90 and 120,000 visitors, which would be somewhat more than what the Botanical Garden sees. And her preliminary analysis based on these numbers shows that shows a very balanced situation of earned revenue versus the expenses, which is actually better than typical for a facility of this type. We often see that some 20, 25, 30% of the yearly expenses need to be covered by unearned revenue, which would be fundraising. And in this case, it's showing that it could be sustainable and operational without extensive fundraising. And what that means is that as Noyo does do fundraising, they can afford other things and afford to maintain the facility and so forth. So that was very good news. In the next round of study, we'll develop the design further, but we'll also kind of combine all of these the different studies that have been taking place, and we'll include in the operational pro forma not just the revenues for the visitor center, but also look at how the scientific function gets funded and is sustainable from grant dollars and so forth. So we'll look at all of that as a package, and there'll be economies around certain staffing, like, you know, maintenance personnel and so forth, that would be servicing both facilities. So that is really. I'll just address a couple of the comments here. Somebody asked if there would be a way for the public to observe the researchers at work. I want to point out that yes, again, we'll want to have a balance between people being able to go over and see the stuff that's going on without the researchers feeling like they're in a fishbowl. There's a balance to take place there, but the idea is that you could wander over to the research component and see the different things that are going on and have interpretives that really illustrate the science for the campus as a whole.
So let me add to that, Steve, real quick.
Sure.
Joanna. So we thought that was a great idea to reduce this like sort of barrier between research and education, and then it became clear when we were talking to researchers that that's not always a good thing, and it's also kind of a hard thing, a hindrance sometimes in some of their work. So what we thought was a nice balance is some models actually require researchers to participate in some sort of public education component, like give a science talk, put up an exhibit, or what we've really found to be super great, even at the Discovery Center, is what we call live exhibits. So bring stuff out onto the floor from their work and engage with the public that way. and then also do the tours that Steve mentioned. So that's sort of where we've kind of compromised on that issue.
And some of the science will be really fascinating, and people will love to see it, like a whale dissection, but others will be, you know, a lot of the hard work of science is actually really boring. So boring to look at. So we'll be mindful of that.
Yep. Well, that was great. Thanks, Steve. So any other questions? We've got a great team here. If you want to ask questions or provide any input to us right now, we'd love to hear from you. One of the things that we have wanted to integrate into a public exhibit from the research side is this integrated multi-trophic aquaculture that we want to do. So understanding, you know, what's happening in our kelp forests through have a research exhibit basically that showcases restoration of seaweeds, abalone, urchin, and hopefully one day sea stars. So that's an example of, you know, some of the research that we would like to have a little bit more public.
I would ask a question. This is Gil Dye. I would like to know if you, along with all the planning here, if you've had a succession of possibilities for funding. It looks like an enormous cliff to climb. You know, it looks like a really steep incline that we're going to go through to get this done. Are there any thoughts, or have you explored that, or do you have any input from others about where all this money will come from?
That's an excellent question, Gil, and you know, one that we struggle with all the time. So one of the things is to get the pieces right so we can figure out how to fund them. And what Steve mentioned in creating the 3 different projects is really because we foresee the exhibit hall, the restoration, and the research components kind of being funded by different elements potentially. And so, and they may come, you know, opportunistically, they may come up at different times. So we want to have these pieces, you know, that speak together, but also be able to push forward with some of those components if the opportunities arise. But to create and launch, I'm sure you know as well as anyone, to create and launch a capital campaign is a challenging thing. So what we're trying to create from this work is all of the pieces that we need to be able to do that. But part of that also includes the organizational growth that we need to have as the Noyo Center to be able to launch that kind of capital campaign. So funding is a huge thing, and it's only gotten worse since the pandemic, as you can imagine. Construction costs have increased, Steve tells me, by 40%. So, I mean, it's certainly a challenge. And so it's something my board wrestles with all the time.
Yeah, I would just add one note to that. I think that in terms of the outdoor areas, at least, one of the benefits in really zeroing in on some of the larger state goals of wetland restoration, and you know, particularly around the redwoods, we think that and we'd like to explore this more potential for grant funding for some of that work as well. In addition to really minimizing the amount of large machinery needed to do the work. So both opportunities for potential grant funding and more opportunities for community involvement as well could be a great strategy. And I also see a question in the chat about ADA parking. So that's a great question. The ADA parking hasn't been located yet, but as we move farther into the design phase, it would certainly be closer to the building if parking is farther away than is required by code. But that's a great question.
Yeah, and we'd be sure to incorporate some sort of drop-off situation also that would allow people to get closer to the.
Yeah, retrogressive here on the funding. I want to congratulate the planning that it seems to be in phases that you can address as you go. I'm just thinking in terms of what's on the table now. If there were a stair step, some sort of a laddered approach to where we might approach funders or funding as the process goes forward. So I don't know if anybody's addressing that, but it seems like it should be an element of what you're doing.
Yeah, we are definitely wrestling with that for sure.
Good presentation. Good presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks, Gil.
Any other questions from anyone? Any other thoughts you want to share?
This is Deborah Lennox. This is a really beautiful building. I love the green roof and the way it curves and speaks with the landscape. I love that you've created a courtyard to get out of the wind. So, and I love the ceiling. I think I already said that the using wood in this area is so thoughtful. So thank you. I guess my only concern is this the smell from the sewer plant, if that's something that has come into any of your thoughts.
Well, we've definitely, the main strategy has been to try to put the visitor center as far away from the sewage treatment plant as possible. And that's part of the reasoning behind the way that the site master plan is laid out, that we're putting the kind of workaday stuff, the laboratory and the research stuff closer, to that side of the campus, and putting the visitor piece further away. We'll have to give some thought to what else we could do about the odors.
Well, we've also been waiting for the to see the benefits of the recent upgrade at the wastewater treatment plant. That's supposed to remove the the smell considerably, and they've had a number of hiccups along the lines there. But I think it's getting better. So we're hoping that Hogan's Forest will also help create a smell shed for it.
I was wondering about putting the forest on the north side then, so it would, screen the sewer plant, plus it wouldn't shade the building.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, and something we definitely would like to explore more in the next phase of work is really zeroing in on where these go and how they can serve some of these issues as well. But agreed, if we can place them strategically, there's a potential for blocking some of the wind, but also helping kind of disperse some of the smell.
We've also put our stinkiest assets closest to the wastewater treatment plant. So our laboratory, where we will potentially do marine mammal research and specimen processing, it's actually it's advantageous for us to be near the wastewater treatment plant, and we might, we're trying to keep that away from the rest of the campus as well. So just to clarify, that work is not part of what EHDD and the team are working on right now. We've gone to the city council. We're working on the permitting to build that building. We hope to start construction on that building next year. So that will be the first building that will get built out there. And it is intended to allow us that space to put together this blue whale skeleton, because we need a building big enough to build the huge exhibit that we want to put in the exhibit hall. So we will have a little stake in the ground, at least out there soon. And I think will be a really great kind of engagement into what that space can really do, and also has proved to be super educational already on some of the wetland issues we have with regulatory agencies already because of the site topography. So getting this master plan dialed in right and getting a good comprehensive restoration plan for the site will really benefit us for the whole process.
Sheila, there's a couple of questions about overall time frame for different components.
I saw Mary Ellen wrote that and I was trying to ignore it.
Sorry to bring it up.
Mary Ellen, no, I'm just kidding. That's a great question. We think an aggressive, I hate to say this because it's a little sobering, but we think an aggressive time frame for this type of work and to build the funding is 8 to 10 years. And so again, we are going to be as opportunistic as we can. Like, I look at the public exhibit hall as something that is more individual donor and private foundation funded potentially. The research would be maybe more government grants funded, and the restoration can be state and federal restoration grants funded. So I think when these opportunities come up, we want to be able to utilize them quickly. I would love to see the research component get built as quickly as possible. We just unfortunately kind of had a flush of funding that could have potentially done some of that for us. I don't know that that's going to be the case for the next 4 or 5 years. So we just have to keep our eyes out for what funding is realistic. And we're trying to build the relationships we need to build right now. But I think to get the entire campus done, we're looking at 8 to 10 years. Has there been any consideration of including the sewer treatment plant as part of the wetland restoration similar to Decatur Marsh? You know, the city actually looked at that issue years ago for the mill pond, and and the daylighting of the creeks, and engaged with the same consultants that did a lot of the work on the Arcata Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary. We have talked about using, you know, like Steve will continue to develop, I think, concepts around using water from our site in the wetland and possibly as treatment for some of the gray water. But we're not really looking at that as being integrated in the wastewater treatment plant at this time. It's also important to realize that that 8 to 10 year time frame is also because there's no infrastructure to that site right now. There's no water, power, sewer hookups. There's nothing. So this is not like building something downtown. It's going to take us working hard with the city of Fort Bragg and the owners of the property to figure out how to, you know, develop that infrastructure. That'll be critical to our work as well. I think we'll call it a night. Thank our amazing team for all the hard work. We will be in touch with you shortly, I'm sure, with a list of comments from everybody. And everyone else, have a lovely evening. Enjoy what will be the rains to come, and we'll see you on the next talk. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Hogan. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for your time and comments.